I'm joined from London by the former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Thomas Pickering. From the University of Tehran, we have Setareh Sadeqi, a PhD student in American Studies. In Vail, Colorado, in the United States, the law professor Dave Jonas is there for us. He's also served as the Pentagon's nuclear non-proliferation planner in the Bush administration. And here in the studio with me here in Istanbul is Serhan Afacan. Serhan is the coordinator at the Center of Iranian Studies in Ankara. All four of you, thank you very much indeed for your time. Can we start with a one-word answer from each of you? Okay, we've just had a report from my colleague Randolph Nogel in which he mentions that recent ballistic missile tests that Iran undertook, also another missile which was unveiled by the military. Do we agree that Iran is technically in compliance with the nuclear agreement? Ambassador, one word, please.
Yes.
Setareh?
Yes.
Dave?
Probably.
Serhan?
I believe so.
Okay. Now, this seems to be pretty much the feeling around most of the world. The Trump administration has its own very particular opinion about it. Ambassador, shall we start with you? You've written a piece analyzing what the Trump administration's policy towards Iran is. Do you believe that it's doomed to fail because of its aggressive and antagonistic attitude?
I think if it continues a purely aggressive and antagonistic attitude, it will fail and it might produce conflict. It's interesting to compare Iran with the North Korean approach, in which the president tried much the same policy for over a year, but was persuaded by President Moon Jae-in of South Korea and maybe others to have a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and that has turned things around. So he went from all pressure, all fire and fury to love and romance. Neither is going to produce a useful result in North Korea, and probably not in Iran, but Iran has refused to take up the romantic part.
Dave, you're the only one who didn't say yes. You said probably. Could you expand?
I have always been suspect of Iran, as I have noted in my speaking and writing, because they have consistently violated agreements that are legally binding. For example, while they have never been technically out of compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, they have definitely not complied with the legally binding safeguards agreement with the IAEA, requiring them to reveal all of their civil nuclear programs, which they did not do for 20 years. They were literally out of compliance for 20 years. In addition, they were out of compliance with legally binding UN Security Council resolutions.
Okay, well, that resolution in 2015, when the Security Council endorsed the nuclear deal, some of the language changed subtly. It said Iran is called upon not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of, but the point being, called upon is not a complete directive. It's not a complete demand. And the IAEA, Dave, says that technically Iran is in compliance. So too does the CIA director, Gina Haspel. So too does the European Union. So what's going on with the Trump administration? Is it using this as an excuse to batter Iran?
Not at all. I think the Trump administration did the correct thing in pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. And again, while you're referring to the UN Security Council resolution after the Iran nuclear deal was done, I'm referring to the UN Security Council resolutions prior to it that, for example, prohibited Iranian enrichment of uranium, which they went ahead and did, as they did with a number of UN Security Council resolutions, all legally binding, all of which were violated prior to the deal.
Setareh, let's pick up on that. I mean, today is a very particular day for Iran, but if compromise is the one thing that the West wants to improve relations and seek a truly peaceful coexistence with Tehran, do you get the feeling that the leadership there would be prepared to compromise on any of the issues with which the West has a problem?
Well, I don't think neither the leader of Iran nor the general public will ever agree to compromise anything of our sovereignty and our power in order to come into, I don't know, a treaty or a peace contract with Europe or the US, because as you know, the nuclear deal was not the only treaty that Trump administration has withdrawn from. The administration of President Trump has also withdrawn from other international treaties, and there is no guarantee whatsoever that Europe or especially the US would ever stay with those treaties or contracts. So there is no motivation, there is no reason whatsoever that Iran, whether it be the leadership or the general public, would ever want to compromise anything of their sovereignty and their national identity.
Serhan, what would you say about that, about the possibility of Trump getting what he wants and having the nuclear accord renegotiated? But he's got a particular problem with the ballistic missile tests.
Well, first of all, I would disagree with Dr. Sadeqi on the idea that Iran is not going to make any compromises. They are going to make compromises. Do they want to make any compromises? Certainly not. Do they need to make compromises? Certainly yes. As far as this missile issue is concerned, is Iran's missile program a problem? Yes, for the region and for the world. Is it against the UN resolution on the nuclear deal? No, it's not. The Atomic Energy Agency, for example, affirms that it's not. The European Union and other parts of the deal, they confirm that it's not, and it doesn't mean a violation of the deal. So this, I think that whether it's a problem or not, and whether it's against the nuclear deal should be, I think, differentiated, because there is I think, clear difference between the two. But whether it should be against the deal or not, Iran needs to make compromises against Donald Trump administration, because the Iranian economy is not doing good. And I wouldn't agree, for example, with Dr. Sadeqi that the Iranians, the popular feeling is against making any compromises. No, I don't think so. They want to get rid of this problem. They want to get rid of the sanctions. They want to get rid of the international isolation.
Serhan mentions the sanctions. Yeah, carry on, go on.
Well, as you know, I live in Iran, and as a female academic, as someone who is in contact with a lot of Iranians, especially the youth, I can tell you that no. It's true that we have economic problems. It's true that the Iranian public are really demanding the government to do something about the economic crisis that we are facing. But because experience showed us that, for example, with the nuclear deal, nothing changed within Iran. It's true that a part of sanctions were lifted, but new sanctions were imposed by Trump. And basically nothing about the internal or domestic economy changed for better. So that's why the general public will not agree for the country to make any compromise unless there is a concrete guarantee for that. Like, if we are going to give up on something, we have to be made sure, we have to have some form of a guarantee that a part of these pressures from the international community would be lifted.
Okay, Setareh, listen, if you don't mind, we're just going to temporarily say goodbye to you, and we'll bring you in to the second half of the program. We want to just speak to Professor Mohammad Marandi from Tehran University, who's also joining us. Professor Marandi, thank you very much indeed for your time. I'll come to you in a moment. But Ambassador Pickering, can you just explain to us, and then Dave, you can pick up on this point, why the Trump administration and also the European Union see Iran as a threat to conflicts that are happening across the Middle East, and why it's asking Tehran to temper its involvement in those foreign conflicts? It's not as if this hasn't happened throughout history.
Well, I don't speak for the Trump administration, and I don't agree with all of their points. They see ballistic missile testing as something that could put Iran in a position to increase its threat to the region and perhaps beyond. They see involvement in both Yemen and Syria in what has become an internationalized set of civil wars as making the problem worse rather than better from their perspective. They see the traditional concerns people have always had about Iranian problems with religious freedom in Iran, with human rights, with supporting organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas, which the United States from time to time has determined to be terrorist organizations. So that's in the long lexicon of concern. The really crazy thing is, why should we give up a treaty that in fact limited Iran's capacity in a very serious way to get nuclear weapons in order to do nothing in return. Just bluster, just saying we're going to do a better deal, but not in any way at all succeeding. And why would Iran make a deal with a guy who violates a treaty? The treaty itself was made to keep Iran from getting out, and there was no exit clause. There are only time limits. The United States obviously got out, and it violated the treaty by doing so. So this is essentially taking a serious mess and making another mess to think that it might make it better, but doing nothing in return. And the Iranians, of course, are not going to cooperate, having had the return they expected from the agreement cut off by the United States. The United States, in fact, sanctioning its European allies and friends, allowing Iran to drive wedges between them, and obviously giving Russia and China a much more preferred position than they already have, something that clearly has not been in the traditional U.S. policy interests. So, other than that, a perfectly splendid procedure by Mr. Trump.
Ambassador, are we at the point where the White House is simply impervious to even the advice that comes from allies? Because many people would see the European Union's position as being more reasonable, certainly, regarding their position that if you help Iran to do international trade, for example, with this new financial mechanism that major European Union countries have put in place, INSTEX, that is a way to keep Iran on side. Is the White House not listening to any of its allies anymore on this issue?
I'm shocked you asked Mike that question. The day after he was inaugurated, we were at that point, or maybe the day he's decided to run for election. He doesn't care what other people think. He doesn't care particularly what the Europeans think. He thinks they ought to pay more money for their own defense, and I don't disagree with him. But I think the notion that he's influenced by other people, he said just a little while ago, I listened to some folks who told me to turn it down, and they haven't made any progress, so I'm going to turn up the volume on all kinds of things like getting out of Syria, getting out of Afghanistan, bringing Kim Jong-un into another summit, hopefully with more preparation than he's had in the past. But the process of listening is not something that Mr. Trump either practices or enjoys, and that's quite obvious from what you've seen.
Dave, what do you make of the White House's intransigence on this issue? Because you've outlined earlier for us what the problems are, but in terms of the resolution towards them, is this really the right way to go about it? You know, I mentioned that foreign interventions are a part of the whole world's history. Just over the past 30 or 40 years, what, the Contras in Nicaragua, the Taliban, for goodness sake, who used to be the American allies, the Mujahideen, the YPG terror group in Syria. All of these are instances of the Americans getting involved in foreign ventures. And now they're saying to Iran that if you don't desist, we're going to impose sanctions on you, which of course they already have. Trump says they're the biggest and hardest in the world.
First of all, I don't speak for the Trump administration either, like the ambassador, but I do respectfully take issue with a number of things he said. And I was not the nominee for Energy Secretary, but the nominee for the General Counsel of the Department of Energy. The ambassador complains that the Trump administration withdrew from a treaty. Of course, the Iran nuclear deal was not a treaty. It was a political agreement. It was nothing more than a handshake.
That happens to be a canard. You don't understand international law.
Let me finish. I let you finish. It was a political agreement. It was just a political statement, non-legally binding, of political effect only. And it really bothers me when people act as though it was a legally binding treaty with withdrawal mechanisms, etc. You can't do a non-legally binding treaty and then complain that someone wants to withdraw from it when all it takes is a policy change to withdraw from it because it's only a political commitment.
Okay, Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. We're going to say goodbye to Ambassador Thomas Pickering now. We really very much appreciate you spending time with us on the Newsmakers. And we'll go to Washington, D.C. and say hello to Jamal Abdi, who's president of the National Iranian American Council. Jamal, welcome to the Newsmakers. Just hold on a moment there. Let's go to Tehran and speak to Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor, if we go back to just about pretty much 12 months ago, 13, 14 months ago, when all of those huge protests were taking place across Iran, they started off as a complaint against economic mismanagement. They became probably something else, didn't they? But then they disappeared. what would you say is the feeling amongst those tens of thousands of people who came out onto the streets of Iran if they were to get some sort of assistance from the outside world to change the system under which they live? Would they accept that assistance, do you think?
Well, first of all, today, which is the 40th anniversary of the revolution, we had rallies across the country. And in Tehran alone, it was well above 1 million people who participated. Yet, for example, when you look at the international news media like CNN just today, they were reporting something quite different. So I think one has to look at the context. People in Iran protest. Some of them protest for economic issues. Some of them protest for political reasons. But when you look at the polls or when you look at the elections in Iran, we see that the country, the political order, the constitution has a very high degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The last presidential election had roughly 74% turnout, according to polls carried out by Western institutions like the University of Maryland. The population in Iran strongly supports the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think that instead of, if one is going to look at protests that are well covered in the West because of their position towards Iran and make a general judgment about the country, then I think we can also say that France no longer has political legitimacy because the yellow vests are out on the streets. So the president of France should step down. I don't think the French government would appreciate such an argument, and neither would its allies. So the only thing that ordinary Iranians want from the West is to abide by international law and to respect the international community. The Iranians have respected their side of a commitment, even though many in Iran believe that the Iranians gave too much in the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal. But still, we accepted the deal. Our side is committed to it, and the other side isn't. Not only is the United States not abiding by the deal, and of course Trump has exited from it completely, but also the Europeans are not abiding by it. They are basically following Trump's footsteps, and they haven't, despite signing the agreement, the French, the British, and the Germans, and the whole of the EU has been abiding by US dictates. So I think it's it's very different from the narrative that we're hearing in the United States or in the West. The reality on the ground is that Iran is the victim, and the United States is the country that is violating its commitments, that's trying to hurt ordinary Iranians, and it's aligned itself with despotic regimes, and it's aligned with those despotic regimes in starving the people of Yemen.
Professor, I think that's a very valid point you make, that it's almost impossible and indeed unfair to make an overall assessment by what we see on our TV screens, pictures that are beamed all over the world. And that's why you're on the program, and that's why, Jamal, we asked you to come onto the program as well, because as an Iranian American, you have a very particular perspective. Before I ask you for your opinion, let's play a clip of President Hassan Rowhani, who has talked about how his administration is going to approach the antagonism that's coming from the outside world and how it's going to protect itself and behave. We have that clip, I believe.
We have not asked and will not ask for permission for anyone to develop our missile capabilities, and we will build a wide range of missiles that include ground-to-air, air-to-air, land-to-sea and ground-to-ground. We will continue along the path we have chosen, and we will develop our military power.
Jamal, with enemies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, why would Hassan Rowhani say anything different? The dynamic of Middle Eastern politics has changed quite dramatically in the past few years when you have Saudi Arabia aligned with Israel. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, said just a few weeks ago that his country's cooperation with Israel has never been as deep as it is now. And all of this that the Trump administration is doing with Jared Kushner, as we know, his point man on the Middle East, is setting up Mohammed bin Salman as the man who's going to oppose Iran in the Middle East. How could Hassan Rowhani say anything else apart from what he's just said here?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. The issue right now is that the United States is, I think some would say ironically, the party that is pursuing an ideological policy, whereas Iran even if people are concerned about ballistic missiles or support for regional proxies, I don't think that you can make the argument that this is not a rational approach to the circumstances that surround Iran. I think that other parties to the nuclear deal are also trying to pursue a interest-based policy, and for Europe that means trying to sustain the deal. For the United States, an interest-based policy would be to try to build on that nuclear deal and to try to secure additional compromises as part of follow-on negotiations. And you could really envision a parallel universe where the United States did stick with the Iran nuclear deal, and instead of having to lobby level threats on TV and from thousands of miles away, you'd actually have a dialogue involving Iran where some of these issues could actually be negotiated instead of what we have now, which seems to be an aggressive attempt to return to the status quo between the U.S. and Iran, now with a region that has become so divided up and so entrenched in this proxy battle between U.S.-aligned interests and Iranian-aligned interests. And without dialogue, I just don't see a happy ending to this scenario.
Jamal, how much is a case in this kind of applies to quite a few of Donald Trump's foreign policies of Tehran having to wait until his presidency is over and then pursue whatever path is to be pursued?
Yeah, this is becoming sort of an adage. I think it is true that Iran is going to try to wait out this administration. And the reason is because this administration is behaving as such an outlier within, U.S. foreign policy. I think it's in many respects a return to previous administrations' policies, but the nuclear deal was a seismic shift. And to radically switch back and abrogate that agreement does not really jibe with what America is sort of supposed to represent on the world stage, a country that's interested in international order and an agreements-based form of diplomacy rather than just issuing edicts and sort of behaving as a dictatorship. I think if the United States was not so isolated on this issue, if the Trump administration had actually consulted with its partners and managed to actually convince any other country other than Israel and the Persian Gulf Arab states, I think that it would be very different. I think Iran would not be able to wait out this administration. But because this administration is operating completely isolated, because there is no continuity between this administration and its predecessor and potentially with its successor, I think the rational approach here for Iran and the world is to try to sustain this agreement as long as it can and hope that a different political order comes to Washington after the 2020 elections.
Okay, gentlemen, we are actually out of time, but I'm going to push it a little bit. Dave, I can give you 30 seconds to sum up where we are today in this situation.
I think that the EU's recent statement shows, in fact, that they're actually moving closer to the Trump administration's position. I think that the Obama administration wanted a deal very badly, and in doing so, neglected to include very important aspects of a deal that would have been acceptable to the world and the Trump administration, such as control over Iranian terrorism activity and missile activity. The fact that Iran just rolled out a new cruise missile, which they claim is defensive but hardly is evidence of the fact that the Trump administration was right in ending the deal, because it's the missile activity and the terrorism activity and support for activity in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, that is so troublesome on the world stage right now.
Okay, Professor Marandi, 30 seconds, otherwise we won't be able to fit you in.
Well, I think it's ironic that an American would speak about terrorism in Yemen when they are helping to starve the country, and their allies are directly in contact and in cooperation with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And it's ironic that any American would speak about terrorism in Syria when the United States document, the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, explicitly states that the United States and its allies helped extremists in Syria from very early on, and that the extremists were the dominant force and the United States supported them because of that. And it's ironic that Hezbollah, I assume he means, is a terrorist force in Lebanon, when it was Hezbollah that expelled the Israeli regime when it was occupying half the country. And the reason why Iran has a missile defense capability is to prevent the United States, which constantly threatens the country, from 40 military bases that surround the country from attacking. What keeps the U.S. at bay is Iran's strength.
Okay, Serhan, I promise in the second half I'll give you more of a chance. But to the three of you joining us from abroad, thank you very much indeed for your time, gentlemen.